Hi, I'm Ayue, and if you will, we're gonna talk about how to record folk music, or more specifically, how we recorded this Irish music folk CD in a very traditional way. So even though you're a musician that's not interested in recording music yourself, if you're gonna go to studio, there's some questions you have to ask yourself and your band. So stay tuned because we're gonna talk a lot about this kind of stuff. We're gonna talk about how to record instruments, but also how they relate in relation to how you play them, how you arrange the music, etc., etc. First of all, let me talk about how we recorded this music album. What we did is we decided to record the four instruments at the same time in the same take with different microphones. And this can seem risky, and it's also a little bit vintage, a little bit old-fashioned, but it's very important because some bands just play in tune, in time, but other bands decide to be flexible, to change the tempo, to respond, to improvise. This was quite a long process, obviously. We spent about 3 sessions, more or less 8 hours each session, of course, with lunch breaks and breaks to listen what we've been doing. But it was just, a very big, boomy hall, just like an industrial warehouse. And we're just playing and listening and improving and changing. And this is just it, that there's no studio magic. We've tried to keep to the minimum any post-production, anything like that. So, when you record like this, which is, of course, very romantic and very vintage, but as I said, it has to do with the interpretation and the organicness of music. There is a lot of things you have to take into consideration. First of all, even though you have individual mics for each instrument, they're not completely isolated from each other. So if someone makes a mistake, you cannot just think, okay, we're going to mute that microphone and record it again, because that mistake is heard a little bit in the other microphones. In this album, I've had the role not only of playing the violin, but of being the recordist, which means I placed the microphones, I hit the record button, but then my friend Manuel González Gallan, he's a great mixer, he has great ears, he got all the data and he did the final mix, the mastering, etc. So that was a bit of compromise for him and for me, obviously, because normally the same person does the two things and he knows the process, etc. So there was a lot of speaking with him, understanding his view, telling him our view. And what I found out is that even though he's the one doing the mixing, my decisions as a musician and as the recordist would define the sound of the album much more than what he would do later. Of course, he would do, volumes and EQ and compression and mastering, etc., all those things to make everything perfect and sit all together. But the sound really is produced in place with the musicians. So it's very important to have good musicians, good instruments, to be played correctly, to not have mistakes that you have to fix afterwards. And of course, to be playing in tune and always checking that you're in tune. That's something you have to do every time when you're recording. So if you're a musician and you're thinking about recording, think about that. You are going to be the one that decides about the sound. First here, then talking to the engineer and telling him what you want. The easy way to do this is to go online and check different bands. If you like Irish music, you have a very broad catalogue to check, from the Dubliners, to the Corrs or the High Kings, or that kind of path. Then the new breaking trad people, people that don't want to follow the tradition anymore, to very ancient live recordings. There's a lot of different decisions, and you're not going to know if you don't know about mixing, but you will know that you like or dislike the sound. So you fetch them and you take them to your engineer and you discuss with him. Why do I like this? Why would I like my CD or my album to sound like that? And if you do know a little bit about engineering, you will know, sound engineer, you will know that there is some decisions like, how thick does my guitar sound? Is it stereo or mono? Is it the center of the mix, or is it just a little detail? Do I have, the melody in the center, or do I have them panned right, left, etc.? Let me give you an example of what we did, okay? Because we have 4 instruments, we have a guitar and a Bodhran, and then we have violin and flute. We thought that it would be very interesting to have a very symmetrical core of guitar and Bodhran in the center, like in rock and roll, and then get the melodies to the sides, so we kind of not a double tracking, but we have violin in one side and flute in the other one. And when we have vocals, they will sit in the middle, and every other accessories like a banjo or a mandolin, that again will go either side. What this gives you is, it gives you a stereo image, it gives you the impression that you're sitting with a band around you. So without having to fight with, volumes and compression, you just pan the violin and the flute hard right and hard left, and that will give you a more distinguishable mix. So, if you're recording 4 musicians at the same time, you gotta choose a place that sounds correctly. You cannot just record in a room, in a bathroom, because it's not gonna sound nice. So I chose to record in this very big reverberant space. And people asked me why they thought that it would not sound good. And people have this idea that churches don't sound good, but they do sound great. The problem is that if you are far away from the source of sound, you hear more of the delay than the actual sound. If you're close up to the sound, it sounds beautiful. It has a direct, full tone with the reverberance, which is also in stereo because it's a big place. So that was my approach, number 1. I'm going to sit the people in a big room, quite a distance of maybe 2 meters from each other, and I'm going to place the microphones relatively close to the musician. That means it's a very direct sound and there's a little bit of natural reverb. We will talk about this later. But also, it's very important to talk about isolation. Because yes, even though everyone is going to have a little bit of spill in the other people's microphones, this can be minimized. And what that gives you is less phase problems, more control in the, panning and volume, etc. in the mixing stage. So what I did is I chose a big place because, of course, my microphone captures what comes from in front, but not so much what comes from behind. So ideally, if I place the flute player there, this microphone will not capture him. That's ideally. But the fact is that his sound will come back, touch the wall, reflect, and come in the sensible side of the microphone. So if you get those walls and you really push them far away, essentially what you get is more isolation. And this is, it doesn't seem natural, but it is. The fact is that the more distant that wall is, the sound that comes that way will take more time and will, disintegrate before coming back. And this we have achieved. I have recordings of the same musicians, the same distances, the same microphones in much smaller places. And the amount of leakage is incredible. So if you're going to talk about leakage and you're interested in that, first of all, find a big boomy place and place the microphones closer to the sources. Also, there's just one little thing about acoustics that people don't take into consideration. Some waves of sound are actually physically very big to visualize. I mean, it's air pushed and opened and pushed again. But this takes a space, obviously a volume. And for example, those of a bass drum are very low. They can have like this length in between, compression, decompression, and compressing again. It's a very big space. So think about this. If you're playing in a small place, your sound is going to go back and forth, and they're going to be fighting. You're not going to allow all the potential of your sound to develop. If you go to a much larger place, like a medium hall or even a stairway, which is very high, all those sound waves will just go in one direction and develop and then disintegrate. And when they come back, they will be just nice, soft reverb, but they will not give conflict. Therefore, if you have a big place, your sound will sound fuller up close, and from distance it will sound very, very muttered, very not very distinguishable. So always, when you're thinking about acoustics for playing, for recording, whatever, think of a big space with close-up microphones if you want isolation and a nice reverb and a nice thick sound. There's obviously a lot of kinds of microphones. We can reduce this to dynamic and condenser, which sounds goofy, but let's say this. There is live microphones and there is studio microphones. Very simple definition. A live microphone as a dynamic microphone, as those that are handheld and have this ball there, to me they resemble like hooligans. You have to, if you want to say something to a hooligan, you have to hold his face and shout to his face to make sure that he's paying attention, and then he will listen to you, right? So this microphone is the same thing. If you're shouting at it, if you're producing a loud volume to it, it's great. And all the things that happen around it, they're not going to get as much captured by the microphone. This is great because if you're playing live and you have a very loud drums and very loud guitar caps and you're the singer, you want to have your voice specially in that microphone. So what you do is you put it really close to your mouth in a very consistent distance, and that gives you the best ratio between your voice and the rest of the noise. However, studio microphones are very different. They're very sensible. They are like your mother-in-law. You don't have to shout at her. They hear everything, even if you're next room or a couple of houses away and you do something bad, she's going to notice, she's going to know. So you have to be very careful with using studio microphones because they capture a lot of stuff, everything that's happening around you. If you drop a needle, it will be picked up. But it's great because that gives you a fuller, thicker, more beautiful and realistic sound most of the times. So if you're playing acoustic music, I see no reason at all to use dynamics, except if you are playing live. But because, drums is a very loud thing, electric guitar is really electrical, but acoustic instruments like these ones, we are very used to listening to them and knowing how they sound. So you should try to, evoke the best sound possible, the most realistic choice. That's why it's great to use this studio condenser microphones. And of course, those are more expensive. You don't have to spend a lot of money. There's some brands that do things really well for a nice price. But you should also avoid very cheap ones because they don't sound great. They have terrible rejection. They have a lot of self-noise. When you're recording, you can hear in the background. That's terrible. That being said, this choice of microphones, of course, conditions all the rest. So, now that we've talked about microphones, let's talk about how to actually record these instruments. One important aspect of these studio microphones is the way you play. Really, because when you're playing, you just think of playing with your fellow musicians. But when you're recording, there is this strange thing that happens and you have to react to it, or you think that you have to react to it, right? If we were using a live microphone, I would be very concerned to produce a very thick and full sound and not move around a lot, because that would change the sound. It would be terrible. Nice thing about studio microphones, you back them up a little and you can just forget about it. You're just playing with your friends and you don't have to fight him. He will come and pick your sound and it will be great. You don't have to, fight. And if you play silently or with more nuances, this guy will capture. So that's a very good reason if you're a musician and you want to forget about recording, you just play some of this in a good place where they sound good and then you forget about them. You just play and listen to the other musicians. First question that you have to ask yourself when you're recording is, where do I place the microphone in relation to my instrument? And that's a very good question. In this setup, we had, apart from the vocals, we have 2-on-2 instruments in which they share similar qualities. We have guitar and bodhran, which are very boomy and lack definition sometimes. And then we have the extreme opposite. We have some flutes and we have the violin, which always are very harsh. And actually it's two different battles with these two guys to make them sound soothing and nice and soft and not harsh. And with guitar and bodhran, what you want is to have a very clear, distinguishable sound and not too boomy. Because if you combine the two of them, it's going to be so boomy you're not going to hear anything. It's going to be low end everywhere. So let's discuss how to deal with these sources individually. Take acoustic guitar first, because it's going to be the foundation of this album and probably most of your music if you're playing acoustic. One of the things about acoustic guitar is that it's very, very boomy, right? The common sense tells you, okay, there is a sound hole here, so I should put the microphone directly in front of this sound hole. But if you check any tutorial on YouTube, you will see that this is not the correct way to go about it, because it's very boomy. There's a lot of air coming out. That air pushes the capsule of your microphone, and it doesn't allow it to capture a lot of the other vibrations that happen. So what they always tell you is that it's a good idea to point somewhere around here, which will give you a good balance between the boominess of this area and, the scratching of the strings. Always think of these instruments as a mix of sources. You have the boominess of the box and the high end of the strings. And of course, if you use your nails or your fingertips or a pick, that will change. So let me do some experimentation with this instrument, and I will place the microphone in different places so you can hear. So if you see the making of or the videos, we were sitting in a square pattern. Each one was looking directly to the center and had someone in front, someone to the right, and someone to the left. In the case of the guitar, who had the bodhran in front and the violin to the right. To the left is the flute, and the flute is always the hardest instrument to isolate because it's very strong in the high notes. So what I did is, after I've chosen the position here, I rotated the microphone so that the capsule was looking a little bit more towards the sound hole, which gave a little bit more of boominess. But also the rear was pointing towards the flute. And think about this. A microphone has a very good rear rejection. It forgets about what is behind, or it eliminates or doesn't listen to what is behind. Especially, as I told you, when the walls are far away, because the sound is not going to bounce up and go in again. So in this case, after we've placed the microphone here, what we did is we angled it so that it was looking away from the flute and it had a little bit more of the boominess, and that ended up sounding really thick. If you're looking for more options, obviously you can put the microphone wherever you want. Two also very used positions that people don't talk about is pointing at all of this area, you know, the resonance box or whatever. This actually produces a very mellow and nice sound, or just backing up like 1 or 1.5 meters, and that will give you the sound of the whole guitar in conjunction with the ambience. So a Bodhran is another example of a sound that can be so boomy that you would not understand it in the mix. It would not stand out. And this really starts with you. Even though guitars are pretty much standardized and you can have, you know, there's very little differences in sizes and in sound, just you can change your strings. With Bodhrans, there's such a big range and tunings, etc., that you as a player or as a sound engineer have a lot to say about it, right? So the diameter, the deepness, the kind of skin, the tension, what you use to play, all of that dictates sound, which can be very high-end and reverberant, or very low-end and dry. In our case, I'd read somewhere that the Bodhran should be a deep and strong instrument like thunder, and there was a very old reference, so I wanted to pay tribute to that. So I detuned the Bodhran, and it was a very big Bodhran, as you can see. And Sergio was playing it kind of with not a lot of strength, but very musically, which means there is a lot of sustain in this sound. Even when you start, you know, putting your hands in the skin and muting it, it's very, very deep. So, with an instrument like the Bodhran, which can get so boomy, it's not standardized, right? You can have different diameters, skin, deepness, tension, tippers. It's up to you, and you have to be able to recognize what sounds will work or will not work in your mix. For example, this Bodhran is very deep, very, very deep. And we chose to use this one because we were all metalheads in our teenagers. In our teenagers, we love deep sounds and deep drums. But after recording it, I realized that it was very deep. And of course, in the album, if you have a good speaker system, you will hear the punch in the subs. It's very deep. It's there to complement the guitar. But if you're just using cheap headphones or the cell phone or the laptop, you're not going to hear the Bodhran at all, because those low end need a big system to be heard. So my idea with the Bodhran was to not intercept with the guitar. So that's why it's deeper. So if you look at the frequencies, if this is the bass of the guitar and then it has all of the harmonics over it, all of the overtones, the fundamentals of the Bodhran sit underneath. They don't match frequencies. So if the guitar is like in 150 to 100 hertz, the Bodhran was in the sub, around the sub. I think it was 80 and 90 hertz, and all around that it was a very thick thing. And that means that, again, if you're using a cheap system, you will not hear correctly. So with the Bodhran, a lot of modern musicians are starting to change just their technique, because the Bodhran will not be heard live or in the studio. They change the wooden tipper. They change it for the rod, or this wooden barbecue sticks held together with duct tape. And you can hear that instantly. These wooden rods have this click to them. Internally they make that noise, which adds to the sound of the Bodhran. And this they started doing, of course, to be audible. If you see someone like John Joe Kelly, he will be playing most of his concert with this rod, and then if the guitar stops or if he has a solo, he will go back to the wooden stick, because then he can project his low end without coming in conflict with the guitar. So that was a big decision for us. We chose to use rods instead of traditional tippers, and that adds the high end to the sound, and it helps you hear the Bodhran. Same with the guitar. If you add some of that high end in the strings, you make the guitar more distinguishable and understandable. However, after listening to the album, I asked myself if really it was a good idea to use such a boomy Bodhran. Of course, we love the sound and we love to hear in the subs, but for the next time, I would love to try to compare it with something like this. This being the same diameter and being goat skin as well, this is very tense. Because I made this the traditional way, instead of this one is made like a drum with, you know, tensioning rig, etc. And this one was just, I might make a video of how to make a Bodhran. I made it with a skin that was wet, I glued it there, and then as it dried, it started to gain tension. So maybe if you want to be on the historic side of things, maybe this is the sound that you're looking for. Even though this is very tense, and of course we're not used to this kind of sounds, but maybe we should see how this competes with the guitar, because I think that this would be heard much more clearly. In the case of the Bodhran, I don't know why everyone goes ahead and puts a microphone here in the back. Maybe because it does not disturb the musician, but I don't, especially live, and I don't like it at all. I think that all the drums that I've seen, when they're mic'd from outside, they sound better than from the inside. Actually, I tried, and I'm going to show you. If you mic the inside, you will get this kind of fundamental, which is related to the volume of this, you know, of this small drum shell. That dictates the fundamental frequency, the lowest fundamental frequency. But being here outside, like our ears and like the musicians, this has a much broader low end, and that's what I wanted to capture. So my choice, just after reviewing it again with the band, we heard the sound here, and we chose this one immediately. And again, I told Sergio that the distance should always be this one, and that was a constant. He was a great guy, maintaining that, not moving around and not hitting the microphone with his tipper. And again, the microphone was angled away from the flute, because the flute was to his right. So again, we're always conditioned to, you know, to try to isolate the flute as much as we can. And that's what gives us a very nice and low and isolated Bodhran sound, which is something a lot of people fight to get. Flutes, penny whistles, tin whistles is a world where a lot of people fight. The fact is that some people say that the flutes are the hardest instrument to record. I don't think so, but fair enough, it's very difficult to record them. You know, with microphone movements, there is little that you can do to make this better or worse. The only thing that you can do is change your model of flute. This one costs 8 euros, this was costs 20 euros, and the ones that we used in the recording did cost a lot more, obviously. So this one sounds a lot like an airy thing. This one is a little bit thicker. You can hear right away it has a more pronounced fundamental frequency. And that is how you debate about the amount of high end in flutes. You just choose your instrument. Position. Again, I told him to get his flute in his mouth and be comfortable, and then we set up the microphone to have like this distance or a little bit more. And that proved to be very natural. But again, the choice of flute did condition the sound that we're getting the most. And of course the violin is where I've paid a lot of attention, being my instrument, or the one I play in this band. With the violin, again, it's the same compromise. It's a very high-end and harsh instrument to listen to. So most people will tell you that you should mic this area, which is the area that produces the most of the sound. It also produces this friction sound that comes from the collision of the strings, or the friction there. Not those overtones, but in general, this sound gets recorded as well. So if you want to avoid that, you should point your microphone away from this area. Of course, if you do point like I did, I always point my microphone here. And what that gives you is, again, less of that scratchiness and more of a general sound, but it also reduces the amount of body of fundamental frequency that you get, which obviously happens here. So again, it's a compromise with the violin. If you want to lose that harshness, you lose body as well. You lose the thick sound of the bottom as well. So you can try gut strings, but they need to be very thin. Otherwise, you will have to, have so much tension that they will not sound like gut strings at all. And you can just experiment with position, like here, or the underside, or distance. Of course, the way to get away with the harshness is to gain distance. But again, if you gain distance, what you're losing is a bit of the fundamental. You're gaining the atmospheric sound, and you get all the other instruments coming in your microphone. You obviously cannot change your bow to make a different, a more mellow sound. With bows, there's just bows that make the violin sound good, bows that make it sound bad, and those that make it sound nothing at all. So you just have to use maybe a wooden bow that you like, that you're used to. This is about technique more than sound. And I would say that sound is obviously how you play and how you place the microphone. So yes, I was here. Ideally, you would mic an instrument like this pointing down, because that would mean it's parallel to the surface and it gets more body. But all my colleagues were in front of me and I want to reject their sound. So I have the microphone pointing at about this area, but also giving the back to the flute and the guitar and the Bodhran. So maybe that's why when I was listening to the violin, I thought, I need a little bit more of body. However, I gave this sound to my friend Manuel, the engineer, and he said that it was the best violin he had heard because he didn't have those squeaky sounds that normally you would have to EQ out in a very, surgical way. So try to play here, try to mic here, try to have it perpendicular to your surface, and you would get enough good sound without that harshness. Let me give you a little bit demonstration of that. So that was all. I know I've talked about a lot of very different things, but if you are interested in folk music or recording, I hope this will help you to get a better idea of our own sound, of how we interact with microphones, how to record. And if you do record, you will find that you will learn a lot about your music and how you play with others. It's the best way to learn, of course, to have a teacher, but also to be your own judge and to listen to yourself. I'm going to link some things in the description. I'm going to link the videos that I've made about how to play the Bodhran. If you visit this channel, you will see another video of how ancient Irish music would sound. And if you visit the Dingle Bastard channel, you will see all these recordings that we've done and how they sound. And you can compare with what you like and what you don't like. And definitely have a great time playing and recording your music. And we'll see you next time.